I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 119th episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. We are going to be talking this week about ethics. I don't know, maybe it's the American political season that's making me think about all these things. There's also something going on over in the UK right now, a legal bill called the Psychoactive Substances Act 2016. This is only a cause for uproar if you are a citizen of the UK, but if you are a citizen of the UK, it may indeed be cause for an uproar. The long and the short of this one is that this was an effort to fight the legal high industry. Biochemists are able to slightly tweak chemicals known to have psychoactive effects and are essentially able to create new chemicals faster than they're able to be processed, categorized, and scheduled by the UK drug scheduling systems. So they decided to flip the law that they had on its head. New compounds, instead of being innocent until proven guilty, are basically being considered guilty until proven innocent. They need to be explicitly made legal as opposed to the other way around. Psychoactive under this definition is any substance which is capable of producing a psychoactive effect in a person who consumes it, which when you think about it is ridiculously broad. Everything from oxygen to chocolate bars to table sugar all produce psychoactive dose-dependent effects, so pretty draconian law. Anyway, thinking about the overall legality and ethics of cognitive enhancement kind of made this seem like a good time for revisiting the idea of cognitive enhancement ethics, and that's what this episode is going to be all about. I'm going to be speaking with Rebecca Roach. She is an ethicist and philosopher at the University of London, so hang around for that. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, we're coming up on St. Patrick's Day. And St. Patrick's Day being what it is, some people will probably be drinking to excess. We've got a little tip on how selecting the right kind of music can actually help soothe a hangover. Stay around for that, but right now, let's kick things off with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So if you're a baseball fan, you have to wait for about a year to see who wins the World Series. If you like the Olympics, you got a 4-year wait. But if you are a fan of the Small Mammal Brain Preservation Prize, you've had to wait since 2009 when the prize was first offered before a clear winner emerged. But recently, a team from 21st Century Medicine was announced as the hands-down winner of the Small Mammal Brain Preservation Prize with a successfully frozen rabbit brain, which very importantly appears to have preserved the brain's entire connectome, all the connections between neurons, synapses, etc., which up until this point has always been sort of the tripwire that made people think, well, you know what, you probably actually couldn't revive this brain because in the previous methods that were used for cooling a brain, ice crystals would form, which would do things like break cell membranes and disrupt connections between the different neurons. But by all appearances, 21st century medicine seems to have solved this issue. Using a protocol called aldehyde-stabilized cryopreservation, they were able to use a process from mainstream cryobiology called vitrification. Vitrification uses high concentrations of cryoprotectant molecules that allow tissues to solidify during cooling without the formation of ice crystals. The problem up until now has been that when this process was applied to whole brains, limitations in the ability of the cryoprotectant molecules to diffuse across the brain structures led to varying rates of shrinkage in the brain as it cooled, and essentially it would sort of tear apart from itself because it was shrinking at different rates. This would not be good if you were trying to bring one of these brains out of deep freeze, but the breakthrough here was to use a chemical fixative called glutaraldehyde, delivering that through the brain's vascular system, which rapidly stops metabolic decay and fixes proteins in place by covalent crosslinks, building a scaffolding around the brain structures, giving the cryoprotectants more time to diffuse. They wound up freezing this rabbit brain down to negative 135 degrees Celsius, so very, very cold. And while they did not wake up this brain and put it back in a new rabbit or anything like that to somewhat more dramatically prove that the technology worked, what they did do after getting it down to this temperature was slice and dice the brain, look at it under an electron microscope, and verify that the connectome did indeed seem to be in place. Cells were not ruptured, synapses were not disconnected, and the structures that we would expect need to be maintained for intercellular and intracellular information are all still there. So pretty exciting stuff. I'm not sure what this means for the people out there that have already been put into cryogenic freezes and had their entire bodies or maybe just their heads frozen. I suspect that the existing technologies that they've used so far are probably going to be a bit of a disappointment compared to something like this. But you got to crawl before you walk, and it seems like this is a major step in the right direction. I would still hold off getting your head frozen solid until the technology advances a few more rungs, but that is probably a choice that should be made carefully based on your individual circumstances. We'll put a link to this article and a picture of a fluffy little bunny on the website.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast where smart people talk about smart drugs.
Picked up a 5-star review over at iTunes from listener Spanked A, who said, I've invested a lot of road trips listening to him, and I would have to say that I have learned a lot. Everything gets broken down so you can understand what's going on. Keep up the great work. Thank you very much for that, and thanks to those of you who have been spreading around Smart Drug Smarts related good vibes on social media or whispering in people's ears, whatever it is you're choosing to do. Thanks also to those of you who have been recent signups for the Brain Breakfast newsletter. We have that newsletter that comes out weekly-ish. You can and should sign up for that over at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. We use that to disseminate some information, also every now and then to pick your brains on opinions that you might have on things that we're doing or thinking about doing. We like throwing up some trial balloons every now and then. I realized to my chagrin that we did not get an episode together in time for International Women's Day, which was earlier this week. I really like doing the holiday-themed episodes when it seems like there's a holiday that kind of lends itself to something cognitively related, but unfortunately we missed that one, despite there being some really interesting possibilities for gender-themed episodes, but we just weren't able to get the experts together in time for this week. Also, sometime this month, almost for sure, we're going to be running out of Nexus and Mitogen over at axonlabs.io. Our couple of supplement stacks. We've got new stuff on order. Everything's been purity tested. Capsules are getting pressed, so soon we'll be restocking our larders, but it's getting to be a fingernail biter to see whether we'll get the new capsules ready before the old ones sell out completely. It's a good problem to have if you don't have your shelves fully stocked, of course, but if you feel like somewhat adding to my anxiety in a good way that we might actually run out for a couple of days or a week, hop on over to axonlabs.io and check out the couple of stacks we have there. Anyway, I think that's everything. Thank you to those of you who have reached out. Happy International Women's Day belatedly. Happy upcoming St. Patrick's Day. Let's move along to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with Rebecca Roach. She is a lecturer in philosophy at Royal Holloway at the University of London and was recently a research fellow in Oxford University's philosophy department. Her interests include the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of psychiatry, applied ethics, and metaphysics. And so she spends a lot of time, as one might expect, thinking about things like amplified intelligence technologies, artificial intelligence technologies, and what some of the ethical hammerlocks that society might find itself in over the coming years are as these technologies advance and become more mainstream, if they should advance and become more mainstream. And so with politics in the air and the U.S. presidential debates going on, I've been thinking about the issues that haven't been being talked about, the social and political ramifications of the kind of things we talk about on this show, and I figured it would be great to get an episode like this together. So what you're about to hear is a fairly freewheeling discussion with philosopher Rebecca Roach.
You know, with any important resource that becomes available in society, there's a range of values that we might want to draw on to decide how to regulate it. So in countries where we sort of aspire to liberal democracy, we're going to be concerned about stuff like fairness, whether everybody has equal access to important resources, which cognitive enhancement is going to be. You know, if it's something that can increase your intelligence, improve your memory, improve your attention, help you need less sleep and so on, then that's something that's going to help people do better in life. You know, you can do better in your career, for example. So we might be concerned that everybody has equal access to this, that it's not just something that only the rich can access. And we might worry then that it would enable the rich to sort of extend their advantage over everybody else. So fairness is one consideration, and just generally sort of a just allocation of resources so that it should be available to everybody, fairly priced, etc., etc. On the other hand, there might be reasons to think that, at least in some cases, that sort of equal access is not the most important value to take into account. So if you imagine an intervention that turned out to improve people's practical reasoning, so enabled people to make better moral decisions, that could be something that, even if it wasn't possible to give everybody equal access to that, it might be something that would improve everybody's lives if politicians had access to it. So, you know, if our political decision making could become fairer through politicians being enhanced, then it might be good for everybody if that happened.
It would be better to give that to the judiciary than it would be to an auto mechanic.
Yeah, and there's lots of examples like that. So if there's some interventions that might improve concentration and alertness, and so it could be beneficial for people like airline pilots and surgeons to use those sorts of enhancements, even if nobody else has access to them. So, I mean, these sets of values might conflict. So we might, if we decide that fairness is the most important thing to take into account, and we think this stuff should only be available at all if everybody can have access to it. If that somehow becomes infeasible, you know, if it's just really expensive, that might mean that we lose out on other benefits. So we lose out on sort of more moral politicians and alert surgeons. So we need to think carefully about what it is that we think we can achieve with these enhancements, and it's going to be something different depending on the enhancement. And also what the most important values are to take into account when we're making these sorts of decisions. Are we more worried about equality than we are about the social good that might arise from a given sort of enhancement? So there's a a complicated set of ethical issues, I think.
I'm thinking about medical interventions that are traditionally really expensive. I know that like the medications that are given to AIDS patients or HIV patients have come down in price quite a bit, but they were famously very, very expensive for a while. And I know that there just seems to be quite a bit of supply and demand as far as the cost of medical interventions. Something like cognitive enhancement that could conceivably be useful to every last member of society. I find it hard to think that there would be, if it were something like a pill at least, rather than maybe a gadget, it's hard to think that it wouldn't drop in price if it were something that we were trying to roll out to, hundreds of millions or billions of people.
Yeah, that seems like it could happen, and especially if it's something where there would be a case for public funding of certain enhancements. If we could help people be more alert, then that might make for more productive workers. So the government might be interested in, or employers might be interested in funding enhancement for workers and so on. This doesn't always happen, does it? Sometimes drugs just remain expensive and not everybody has access to them. So in those cases, there's just going to be the sort of resource allocation issue that we face in medicine all the time. There are scarce resources and we have to make decisions about how we distribute them.
I feel like in a lot of countries, there's sort of a public distrust of the government to a pretty large degree. And whereas on the one hand, if the government said people aren't allowed to have some of these cognitive enhancers, then people would clamor and say, why is the government keeping it from us? But on the other hand, if the government went the other direction and said, we're going to put this in the water supply, everybody should be taking it, then people would get up in arms the other way and say, well, wait a minute, what are you trying to poison us with?
Yeah, that seems likely. It seems perfectly understandable. So both of the examples of the government deciding their policy based on a particular set of values. So either the judgment that these drugs are not the sort of thing that it's important enough for everybody to have access to, or on the other hand, this is so important that we should make sure everybody has access to them. A lot of the time people like to make those decisions themselves. Individuals want to decide whether or not enhancement is going to be important to them. But then there are also cases where if there's a particular intervention that is likely to benefit the user but not society in general, then there seems to be less of a case for the government putting it in the water supply.
Right.
And then it should just be perhaps made affordable and so on. But on the other hand, there might be interesting cases where there might be some social good of everybody being enhanced in a certain way. And it might for some reason be important that either everybody does it or nobody does it. So some people still think this about moral enhancement. So the possibility that we might be able to enhance people's moral decision making and make people morally better people. So in those cases, some people worry that, the people who are most in need of that sort of intervention are bad people, and they seem like the people who are least likely to undertake it.
It's immoral to not want to be morally enhanced.
Yeah, meta-morality. Yeah, so we might worry about a situation where, we just have all the people who are already good enhancing themselves and becoming even better, perhaps, or becoming sort of more effective moral decision makers, and all the really bad people just not taking it at all. And in that sort of case, we might have to question whether there would be a case for state intervention to ensure that everybody takes it. Putting moral enhancement in the water supply. I think that's quite a dystopic scenario, isn't it?
It really is. What's really interesting about all the levels of neural technologies that we're getting to, it feels like, is that some of these things that have been moral questions that people have been philosophically speculating about since the time of Socrates, we're suddenly going to be able to actually make actionable decisions based on some of these things now, which is a first, I think.
Yeah, I think some of the things that philosophers have been familiar with, as you say, sort of for centuries, which are have purely been thought experiments, we're now having to make real-world decisions about it. In those sorts of cases, it's important not to forget the progress that has been made in philosophy. Sort of a lot of people have been thinking about relevant issues for a long time, and it would be important that we don't get caught up in the excitement of technology and just sort of forget about the philosophical questions. So I think sometimes we see this in the debate about the possibility of uploading human minds to computers, so you can continue your existence in a virtual world. And those sorts of cases are being discussed as thought experiments by philosophers for a long time. And they're sort of, there's a range of worries, sort of if you upload yourself to a computer, is that really you? How do we know you're conscious? What constitutes survival versus death in those sort of situations? Sort of is being uploaded to a computer a way of continuing your life, or is it a way of dying and being replaced by a computer program that's a bit like you? So these are all sort of quite difficult questions, and the technology is very exciting. So it's important not to forget these difficult questions while we're getting excited about what technology might enable us to do.
I kind of feel feel like we might be coming back into a golden age of applied philosophy because so many really bizarre things are going to be physically possible. Like I remember there was an interesting case, I don't know, this was like 15 or 20 years ago, where it was like a rape case and the rape victim said, well, at least use a condom or something like that. And then there was the question of like, well, he's still a rapist, but should he sentence less severely because he sort of ameliorated the damage, at least not passing on a disease or impregnating her. You could see something like that with like, if I was a murderer, but I uploaded your mind first, so at least there was a backup copy of your mind, but then I killed you. Is that sort of an extenuating circumstance in this other domain?
Yeah, so on the one hand, it seems like you're doing something good. You're a responsible murderer in some way.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's something quite horrible about that. It would be a very calculating thing to do, wouldn't it?
Yeah, very cynical.
Yeah, we might worry about the mind of somebody who's able to plan a murder that meticulously. Yeah, there's interesting questions about how the law could deal with enhanced people. That's another set of fun questions. What makes for moral responsibility? If you're morally enhanced and as a result you make better moral decisions, are you morally responsible for them? Do you deserve as much credit and so on? The reverse for, if you do something wrong.
If I understand the law correctly, I think right now we sort of have three different classifications as far as whether a person can be responsible. There's minors versus adults, and then there's sort of this third category of people who, for whatever reason, insanity or being very, very mentally slow, just aren't treated as being responsible persons. But you're right. If we have sort of a whole another level of potential enhancement, we might need to think again about extra levels of responsibility that people are given. Unpack that a little for us.
Well, those questions arise anyway. For obvious reasons, the law has to draw lines. It has to say, if you have an IQ above this level, you're morally responsible. And if it's below this level, then you're not. And, sort of reality is more complicated than that, obviously. But we need clear guidelines to have a law at all. And so it's, in a way, the law is quite sort of recalcitrant when it comes to making these sorts of decisions. So you're probably aware of the fact that there is a huge debate in philosophy about whether we ever have free will and under what circumstances we do. And for the purposes of the law, this stuff is relevant because, if someone does something wrong, they weren't free to do anything else. They couldn't have done otherwise. Then we ought to conclude that they weren't morally responsible. So perhaps they shouldn't be punished. So the law, just to have a justice system at all, the law can't wait for philosophers to agree on all this stuff.
Right.
We need practical guidelines. That means that you have, for example, the law treats people as if the law assumes that people have free will, that they're responsible, that we're responsible for what we do, unless there's sort of specific reasons why in a particular case somebody wasn't responsible. So, if you do something wrong and you can prove that you were coerced or blackmailed, then that might be grounds for being treated more leniently. But not just sort of general philosophical worries about free will. So there's a limit to the extent to which the law is informed by these sorts of issues. And it's true that in the case of enhancement, there might be sort of a whole new set of philosophical fun questions to answer about the circumstances under which people are responsible at all, more or less responsible than they normally are. We're going to have to make decisions about sort of at what point it's going to be useful to filter this stuff through to the law. It might be that sort of for practical purposes, we should just ignore this sort of stuff. If you consider a sort of non-enhancement example, if somebody murders somebody else first thing in the morning before they have a cup of coffee and their defence is, I'm always a nightmare before I have coffee in the morning, so please can you not punish me? Please can you take that into account? Then the law's not going to do that. There's certain things that we tend to ignore. We sort of think, well, that's no excuse. That's not the sort of thing we're taking into account.
I love that example, by the way.
It seems likely that at least for a while, when cognitive enhancements start to come on the market and they become more widely used, that at least for a while, this sort of stuff is not going to be taken into account by the law. The law is going to take a view that you're still responsible for your actions in the same way as you were unenhanced, and we're going to ignore all this enhancement stuff. It's probably only if there is a sort of, particularly interesting or serious case that sort of forces the justice system to confront these questions that we might see effect. So you could imagine, for example, if somebody commits a really complicated fraud crime and they cognitively enhance themselves to be able to do it. So, to be able to sort of concentrate and process information really quickly, kind of remain alert and so on.
If we found out that like Bernie Madoff had been doped up on cognitive enhancers while he was defrauding the world, something like that.
Yeah, and perhaps also that he'd cognitively enhanced himself in order to commit crimes. Then at that point, you could sort of imagine somebody in the justice system saying, oh, well, hang on a minute, maybe we should be taking this sort of thing into account. Maybe does this make him more culpable? And it seems like, in the case we've just described, intuitively, yes. Kind of, if you do something to yourself to make yourself a more effective criminal, then surely that's worse than if you hadn't done that. So yeah, if we get a sort of really dramatic case like that, then perhaps we might see changes in the law to reflect sort of philosophical concerns about what happens to people's responsibility when they are enhanced.
Let's look at the flip side of the coin for a moment, because one of the things that I thought was really interesting in a paper of yours that I read was talking about how probably the best thing that we could do as a species globally to increase the intelligence of like the average man or woman on planet Earth right now is to just make sure that everybody is getting adequate iodine supplied to them in their early years particularly. And you had some amazing statistics there. If I got this right, you said that in iodine deficient populations, there's an average loss of around 13 points of IQ, and that this is affecting, I believe, between tens and hundreds of millions of people worldwide right now. Is that approximately correct?
That sounds right from when I wrote the paper. I'm not up to date with the sort of latest figures on it. But yeah, I think an important lesson to take from that is that obviously, if we're interested in cognitive enhancement and it's something that we want to pursue, then we're interested in achieving certain effects. So we're interested in increasing our intelligence, our memory, and so on. To achieve those effects in the best way, it's kind of important not to become seduced by the fanciness of the technology. So the iodine example is something where a kind of really low-tech, cheap, ancient intervention, just sort of putting a well-known chemical in a water supply, could actually have a massive cognitive enhancement effect. And that is going to be the sort of cheapest and easiest option rather than, sort of going around sort of individuals implanting them with chips or, sort of doing some sort of genetic intervention to achieve the same effect. So we kind of need to be careful not to correlate the possibilities that we might be able to realize through cognitive enhancement with advances in technology, because sometimes it can be really low tech. You could view a notebook and pen as a type of cognitive enhancement. It's something that you can use to enhance your memory, just by writing stuff down and then looking at it later. I mean, most of us would think that sort of calling that a cognitive enhancement is sort of a bit grandiose. But even so, if we're sort of interested in interventions that improve our capacities beyond that which we would have normally, whatever that means, then sort of some quite low-tech stuff is going to come under that umbrella too.
I think it was Richard Feynman, the physicist, who said that all an astrophysicist requires to do his work is a pencil and paper, earmuffs, and a waste paper basket.
So there's something quite disconcerting about that. There's something comforting in believing, I suppose, that in order to achieve great things, you need to discover something like some sort of key to success. And if the key to success is sort of quite boring stuff like having a waste paper basket, it's just bad news for everybody who doesn't have the brilliance that he did, I guess.
There's a real emotional appeal towards a low-tech, low-cost, something with readily available technology, like making sure that everybody worldwide has adequate iodine, and so we're not just unnecessarily cutting 10 points off people's IQ. I mean, that seems like, I don't think anybody would argue against that. And yet just taking kind of the opposite stance for the sake of playing devil's advocate, I wonder if, from a whole world perspective, is it better for us to have a couple of extra Isaac Newtons maybe per generation than to bring up the rear, raise somebody from 90 IQ back up to 100? Is it better to find a couple of people that are already at 170 and bring them up to 180 or 190 because the inventions or whatever that are going to come out of those super, super gifted people are going to outmatch anything that the intellectual laggards could do even en masse?
That's a really interesting question. I think sort of in practice, the way the world is, we're already allowing people to suffer impairments to their intelligence by allowing them to be deficient in iodine when it would be sort of really easy and cheap to rectify that. And we also happen to get excited about sort of new technology and impressive achievements. So the way the world is currently, it was probably that we would, as it happens, prioritize creating a new Einstein or a new Isaac Newton at the expense of sort of bringing up the rear, as you put it. But that sort of, whether that's sort of ethical, I don't think so. I mean, you mentioned the point that, well, this sort of utilitarian point that if we create a few more fantastically brilliant people, then we can expect them to make great discoveries and there would be sort of enormous social goods that come out of that. And perhaps the good of that would outweigh the good of sort of making life better for the world's poorest people. But even if that's true, there would still be a sort of a huge amount of uncertainty. You sort of cognitively enhance somebody to a sort of Einstein level. You still don't know that they're going to do anything good in the world, that they're going to discover anything useful, that their discoveries are going to improve people's lives and so on. So we have to take that enormous uncertainty into account. Whereas on the other hand, if you ensure that nobody in the world is deficient in iodine, you can sort of correct the impairments of the intelligence of hundreds of thousands of people, then it's pretty certain that that's going to have a positive effect. There's all sorts of scientific data about sort of the good it does to people to be more intelligent rather than less, but also sort of intuitively. See, if you're intelligent enough to manage your own life effectively rather than have somebody do it for you, then there's an obvious sense in which being able to do that is something that's going to make your lives go better. So, I think we can bring up the rear. We can kind of do both, because bringing up the rear by making sure people living in poverty are not cognitively impaired by their poverty is something that's sort of relatively cheap and easy to do, and we ought to be doing it.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that we will have nothing left to invest in impressive achievements, sort of making brilliant people even more brilliant.
Yeah, agreed. I just sort of wanted to hear from your philosopher's standpoint, if you had to choose one versus the other, which one seemed more appealing?
I choose the bringing up the rear.
One thing that I would love to hear your thoughts on, you've done writing on ultra longevity and artificial intelligence and when we might get to the level of artificial general intelligence, how these computer instantiated persons might be treated legally, socially, etc.
So superintelligence is not one of my areas.
Yeah, even pre-superintelligence. Let's just say that we get a computer that's up to like IQ 90.
Yes. So if we had a computer that was sort of at a level approaching human intelligence, although that's a sort of really vague thing to say. So if we had a computer that was able to do as well in an IQ test as a lot of humans say, and then we can kind of decide whether that's really sufficient for intelligence later, there are going to be some interesting ethical questions raised. So if you had a computer like that, we might want to know, if you turned it off or if you sort of reformatted the hard drive, would that be equivalent to murder? Now, if all that we've got there is a machine that can answer questions or sort of solve the sort of puzzles that you get in IQ tests, you can probably make a computer now that can do that. And that just sort of shows the inadequacy of the measurement, that, we kind of need to think hard about what it is that makes it important not to kill people.
Right.
Is it our intelligence, our consciousness, just the fact that we're a member of a given species, and so on? I mean, I think it can't be linked very closely with intelligence, given that if you murder a very clever person, you don't get punished more severely than if you murder somebody who's a lot less intelligent, at least not officially. So it looks like, sort of intuitively our attitudes to sort of how valuable a life is, our answer to that is going to depend on a number of factors. I mean, I suspect in practice, we avoid thinking about these questions because we have a useful proxy, which is that if somebody's a member of the human species and you kill them, then we can treat that as being as bad as killing anybody else who is a member of that species.
That's a relatively new concept. I mean, that's sort of like post-Enlightenment thinking. There was a lot of times throughout history when killing somebody in a different caste, or like, you killed a nobleman versus killing a peasant, and that was a totally different legal situation that you would find yourself in.
That's a good point, yes. We still do have these sorts of divisions. So you're punished more severely if you kill a human than if you kill an animal, even a sort of advanced higher primate. Most people judge you more severely if you kill a human. Well, whether that's right or wrong is debatable. But the fact is that we don't really think about these questions because we just focus on the fact that, if somebody's a human, then you have certain duties towards them. And we don't have to think very hard about what aspects of being a human grounds those duties, because those aspects don't really appear outside humans. So now you're describing a case of if we have a computer that becomes advanced in a human-like way.
Yeah, if we had a computer that made claims to, to me, self-awareness is sort of a prerequisite. Like, it doesn't matter how smart my pocket calculator is as far as its computational power. If my pocket calculator never says, hey, Jesse, I have these feelings, I like being a pocket calculator, once it makes noises like it's aware of its own existence, all of a sudden I start feeling this tug of moral responsibility that I won't, just based on its computational power.
Yeah, perhaps there's two ways to look at this. There's how the philosopher might look at it. Philosophers have been discussing for many years what aspects of us may ground certain duties. So what gives us the right to life, for example? Is it our intelligence? Is it our member of the human species? Is it our capacity to suffer? And so philosophers are used to sort of breaking these things apart. But sort of outside the philosophy seminar room, we're perhaps likely to be sort of guided by those sorts of systematic, rational, analytic ways of thinking about things, but also just by gut feelings and intuition. So as you say, if your pocket calculator started talking to you, then you might find it sort of eventually very difficult to avoid seeing it as sentient, conscious thing, even if it turns out that sort of really you have no grounds for doing that. So imagine if in that case, some kind of computer starts talking to us, starts behaving in certain ways as if it is self-aware, has a moral sense perhaps, so it makes judgments about what's right and wrong. So imagine that we respond to those machines by saying these are effectively humans. From a point of view of deciding how we ought to treat them, we should view these as having sort of at least a lot of the same sort of rights as humans do. And then there's a question about, are we right or wrong when we do that? So on the one hand, it's possible that we might be anthropomorphizing them. It's inappropriate. They've kind of, the fact that they interact with us in certain ways is kind of press certain buttons, or maybe kind of instilled by evolution to make us respond to other humans in a certain way.
Yeah.
And these machines have sort of pressed them. There's been a sort of, something's gone wrong somewhere, and we're kind of responding to them. We're over-ascribing certain things to them, so intelligence, emotion. And so it might just be an illusion that they are human-like. But on the other hand, we would also have to be careful not to be over-skeptical about the sorts of capacities that artificial intelligence could have. You can imagine a situation where somebody says, okay, so this computer is talking to us as if it's conscious. We're having a conversation with it the way that we would have a conversation with another person. And the conversation seems to be as nuanced and emotionally imbued and so on as a conversation with another person. But it's still only a computer. It can't be conscious. We know it's just a computer. It's running a program. It's not conscious. It could just be giving us certain outputs in response to the inputs we're giving it.
Yeah.
And so it just looks like it's behaving a certain way. It's kind of a zombie. So that's the sort of thing that you can imagine somebody saying. But that's actually a problem that we face with people as well. So, all we ever get, we don't tend to go around believing that other people are zombies, that other people don't have minds and are not conscious and are just behaving as if they do. But all we really have is, when we're kind of ascribing mental states to other people, is their behavior. So we judge that somebody's in pain not because we feel their pain, but because they are behaving in the sort of way that people behave when they're in pain. So all we get from other humans is their behaviour, and we infer from their behaviour that they have certain mental capacities such as intelligence, emotions, consciousness, and so on. But we never have direct access to any of these things.
It's like if you cut a worm in half, you see the worm both halves squiggling around, but you're not really sure what the experiential world of the worm is like. Is it suffering or is it just nerve pain?
Right. Yes, I think this problem arises as well with animals, that we have to question whether it's appropriate to be more sceptical about ascribing mental states to animals and computers than ascribing them to humans, given that we can imagine situations where the evidence that we have for ascribing those states is the same in all cases. Just as with humans, I infer that you're sad by looking at the way you behave. Given that I only have behaviour, why would it be inappropriate for me to ascribe sadness to a computer or to an animal if they're also behaving in a way that seems to make that appropriate? There might be certain mitigating circumstances. So if you've created a robot with the intention of it mimicking sad behaviour, then we might have reason to be sceptical. If you just kind of create a robot that can make its mouth into a sad shape, and it can sort of water comes from its eyes or whatever represents its eyes and so on, you can imagine, well, this is just like somebody acting. We don't ascribe genuine sadness to humans who are behaving in a sad way if we know that they're acting in a film. So there's this kind of range of questions about the standards or the criteria that we use for ascribing mental states, sort of genuine mental states, to other people, and how those might translate to ascribing mental states to things that are not humans.
I'm going to go off the rails a little bit here, but going back to like the legal issues of this for things that are clearly being anthropomorphized in probably an illegitimate way. We had an issue, this was probably 15 or 20 years ago in the US, where there was a big hubbubaloo about flag burning, about people that were burning the American flag to protest something they didn't like about the government, and should it be legal or not to burn a flag. And I don't even remember, I think the Supreme Court came down that you could burn a flag if you wanted to, but it was a big issue at the time. And clearly a flag is physical objects. It's not a person, but we were sort of treating it as if it was a person that was being injured or dishonored or something like that. It was just interesting. I wonder if there's a parallel, the way that clearly there were people in America that viewed the flag as having rights, essentially, that other physical objects didn't, and how that might play over into something like a really well-loved robot or AI system or something like that probably isn't conscious, but is convincingly enough human that we start treating it as if it's deserving of respect in the way that the American flag was deserving of respect.
Yeah, that's an interesting example. That sounds like it has to do with a different but related issue, I think. So sort of all societies have certain things that they regard as sacred.
Yeah.
And we have taboos about what we can and can't do to things that are sacred. So burning an American flag for certain people would be viewed as taboo. It's a kind of, you are transgressing a norm about how we treat sacred objects, that we should respect them and so on. So that doesn't immediately imply that if you have that intuition, if you think you shouldn't burn flags, that you view the flags as human-like in a certain way.
I guess what I'm saying is I could see the legal issue coming up almost before the rational, this is a conscious entity issue comes up. Like we might have things that imbue us with feelings that this is deserving of respect legally, even before anybody would really take the step to say that this is like a legal person or a conscious entity.
Right. I think you're right. At some point, somebody's going to be outraged. It's something that's not human is treated in an appropriate way.
Yes.
So they're attached to a robot and somebody destroys it or something
exactly.
like that.
Somebody's going to have configured their robot or their operating system so much that they love their operating system. It's perfectly configured, and somebody else deletes it, and then a question of how much damage has the human transgressor done.
Yeah, and what sort of damage, I think, as well. So in a way, this reminds me of a debate we have about disability sometimes. So if there is a debate in the philosophy of law, for example, about whether something like a prosthetic limb should be viewed as a body part or a piece of property. So if you pull off somebody's prosthetic arm and burn it, ought the law to be treating you as if you had assaulted them, sort of injured them bodily, or should it be treating you as if you'd destroyed a piece of their property? So, kind of crashed their car or something like that. So this difficulty of how to conceive of certain objects pops up in a few places. So, for example, in the way that wheelchair users perceive their wheelchairs. So it's pretty rude to walk up to somebody in a wheelchair and just move their wheelchair, sort of wheel them around without asking them. And it seems to reflect a view that what you have is more than somebody just sitting in a chair. There's a sense in which we view the chair as an extension of their body. You sort of don't touch it too much without asking. And so these intuitions are already rife in certain areas. So we can probably expect to see them pop up again if people become attached to robots, which might happen. There's sort of a debate recently about sort of robots used for therapeutic reasons. So robots used in medicine. So sex robots. There's been news stories about them recently.
Yeah.
If you have a robot that you have sex with and somebody destroys it, how seriously ought we to take that? And we can borrow here from debate that's already going on in philosophy, and the extent to which that is going to filter through to how the law treats people who destroy or damage other people's objects that sort of seem intimately connected with them in some way. I'm not sure how predictable it is.
Has there ever been a time that you can think of historically when there has been, I guess, as many things changing that are going to require new laws and new notions of personhood? It seems to me like we're coming into a really unique point where we're going to need to make a lot of decisions as a society very quickly about what's acceptable, what's not, what counts, what doesn't. I mean, is this a unique point, or is that just me being weird?
I suppose it's unique in the sense that you've been talking about computers reaching human levels of intelligence. I mean, that's certainly unprecedented. Nobody's done that before. There's a slightly different set of concerns, I guess, which have to do with there are certain advances we can make in technology that are really unsettling for one reason or another. So that they sort of they go against certain intuitions that we have, or we just feel a repulsion to them somehow inexplicably. So that sort of thing has happened before with, for example, the creation of when the first test tube baby was created. Leading up to that, this was quite controversial in the circles in which the science was being developed. So, sort of people were worried about whether this was something we ought to be doing, sort of interfering with nature in this way, like creating babies in test tubes and so on. And of course, as it turned out, sort of nobody bats an eyelid at IVF anymore. That's just a normal part of life. So there's some things which can be unsettling because because they're new and we just get used to them and it's fine. And, sort of the discomfort was temporary and not indicative of a serious underlying moral concern.
Yeah.
It was just a bit icky for whatever reason. So that sort of thing, I mean, that's happened several times. So the invention of the telescope was another example. Sort of people find it unsettling to look through a telescope because, you're looking up into the sky and
You're spying on God or something like that.
Yeah, so I mean, we view that as bizarre now, the idea that there's anything weird about looking through a telescope.
That is a really interesting point, though, that some things are passing fancies that this shouldn't be done, this is unnatural, whereas other things like the abortion debate has been live and kicking as something that's been very controversial for 40, 50 years now, and seems it's not going anywhere anytime soon. I wonder what the commonality of things that blow over and are quickly accepted versus those that remain really contentious.
Well, it might be various things. What we would hope that it reflects is that the issues that blow over quite quickly are things where people felt an initial discomfort, but there was no genuine moral concern underneath that. So IVF, for example, sort of something that's a bit strange, the idea of fertilizing an egg in a lab rather than in a body. That's sort of a very strange idea. But, when you sort of think about, okay, so what could be morally wrong about this? Very few people, I think, would sort of be able to identify particular harm that's been done or a particular violation of rights or something like that. Unless you have certain religious views, you're unlikely to be concerned about something like IVF for sort of genuine moral reasons. So that might be one reason why these things blow over. And something like the abortion debate is ongoing because not only do people react very emotionally to it, but there is a sort of a genuine moral issue at stake. There's the question of how we balance the interests of a woman who doesn't want to be pregnant with the interests of the fetus that she's carrying. And that is a genuinely difficult philosophical question to answer.
Yeah.
So I would hope, taking an optimistic view, that that's the sort of reason why these issues stick around. I mean, perhaps that's not always the case. So the debate about guns in America, for example, doesn't look like it's going away anytime soon. And in that case, well, I may be biased. I don't think people should have guns, but at least from my point of view, there's not a sort of difficult philosophical question to answer here.
I think the gun debate in America is here to stay simply because it's logistically impossible to get rid of all the guns in America. So because of the logistics, the morality won't be settled one way or another because it's an issue that'll keep coming up.
Yeah, so that would be an example of a case, I guess, where you've got this continuing fierce debate. Their emotions are running high, but there's not necessarily a deep moral issue at stake or a difficult moral issue.
The is something else really conscious? That's going to be one that's just going to get more and more interesting as our approach towards an artificial general intelligence gets further and further along. Because you can kind of imagine that, assuming that this doesn't happen all at once, there's just some instant breakthrough and everybody agrees, yes, this machine is conscious. If there's incremental steps towards it, every incremental step along the way, there are going to be people saying, hey, this thing's really conscious now. We need to start treating it like a human being or something close. That'll sure be an interesting process to watch.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. How the fact that it's incremental might affect our views about it. There might be cause to worry about that because it might be that, if computers gradually gained human-like capacities in that way, then perhaps at each step of the way we will just carry on viewing them as computers rather than as comparable to humans. And perhaps at the end of the process there would be a danger where you have a computer that it might be grounds to give it the same sort of rights as a human, but we still largely view it as a computer just because we're by now used to these computers becoming more and more developed. It's probably something that we need to be aware of. The fact that the extent to which it's appropriate to view computers as human-like might be influenced by things like how the technology develops, and that could lead us to the wrong conclusions.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very, very much for Rebecca Roach taking the time for that conversation. If you'd like to read more about her work, she publishes over at rebeccaroach.weebly.com with lots and lots of topics and other rabbit holes that she can skitter down. We'll put a link to that on the website. I've been thinking more and more since that discussion about the issue of representative democracy and artificial intelligence. And by the time that we get to the point where we have artificial general intelligence systems that make a persuasive claim to being self-aware, it's really going to make our current form of democracy unsustainable. possible. Who knows how fast we'll get there, but once we have a situation where we have software entities that can say, hey, I'm here, I've got opinions, it's not a far stretch to think that we'll sort of be morally obligated if we stick to our own principles to give them a vote. But imagine if this is a purely software system and you could boot up a few more voters on your Amazon Web Services account for $15 a month. Well, all of a sudden every political donation would just go suddenly towards cloning more voters with a certain set of political priorities. And that's just not going to work very well. So interesting times coming for that reason as well as many, many others. But that is enough rampant speculation for the time being. Let's move on to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So while I would never ever wish a hangover on anybody, these things do tend to happen, and it's nice to know how to shuffle them off and get rid of them as quickly as possible. And somewhat surprisingly, but apparently backed up by science, is the fact that music can apparently soothe the savage hangover. They've done more studies on music and headaches and music and migraines in particular, but most of the headache studies seem like they would translate pretty well to hangover treatments, according to Alexander Moskop of the New York Headache Center. There's no reason to think that hangovers would be different from pain of any other kind. Music is not as powerful as morphine, but it might be as good as Tylenol. As for what type of music, Lynn Webster, the past president of the American Academy of Pain Medicine, said, "I would think of a hangover as similar to migraines in that you don't want anything too sharp or too loud." But other studies have shown that this is not necessarily the case, and music including heavy metal and dubstep could be effective at reducing pain. That being said, classical music has also been shown to reduce migraines in other studies. That's pretty broad spectrum. We're talking everything from heavy metal to dubstep to classical, so I think you've probably got some latitude, but just don't listen to all of them at once. And of course, don't forget to drink some water and take some B vitamins.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, you heard it. That is the entire episode number 119. This one will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com/119. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell a couple of friends, sprinkle the internet with a couple of Smart Drug Smarts links or recommendations, and thanks again to everybody that's been doing that. Last week's episode, if you missed it, we talked with Matthew Legg about turmeric, and next week I think is very likely going to be talking about the cognitive effects of intermittent fasting, ketosis, longer-term fasting, and that whole bouquet of practices, starting to prime the pump a bit for Water Fast Week 2016. That's probably something that we'll be getting into in June, but can't hurt to start thinking about it now. So a happy and slightly belated International Women's Day, happy upcoming St. Patrick's Day, and I will see you next Friday, as usual, same time, same podcast, and with a perennial enthusiasm for helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.